James L. Carter, also known as Jimmy Carter, was born on October 1st, 1924. Carter was born to a relatively prosperous family. The family included his father, James Carter Sr., a farmer and businessman, his mother, Lillian Carter, who was a registered nurse in Georgia, where Carter was raised. He grew up on a peanut farm where his father believed in hard work and responsibility. Therefore, his father made Carter work on the farm with no allowance. Carter later went to Union College, Georgia Institute of Technology, and Georgia Southwestern State University before joining the United States Naval Academy in 1946. Soon after graduating, Carter married Rosaline Smith, also from Georgia. He later went on to study in a nuclear submarine program. He was then chosen by Admiral Hyman Rickover to serve as engineering officer of the Seawolf, America's second nuclear submarine. Yet Carter's military career was abruptly cut short after his father passed away at only 59 years old. After Carter returned to his childhood farm to help run it with his wife and children. Once Carter's father passed, he noticed how much his father gave to his community after serving in Georgia's House of Representatives. That's when Carter felt the obligation to give back to his community. He was then elected to be the chairman of Sumter County School Board. After becoming the president of Georgia's Association Board, his career skyrocketed. Carter then served 2 terms as Georgia State Senator from 1963 to 1967. In 1966, Carter ran for governor of Georgia but lost. 4 years later, he ran again and finally won. In office, Carter did many remarkable things. Then in 1976, Carter ran for president against Gerald Ford. Carter overcame Ford with the 3 televised debates that pushed Carter to the top. Carter served 2 successful terms from 1976 to 1981, which consisted of working toward peace in foreign and domestic affairs. Later, after his presidency, Carter received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development.
Carter led his presidency with a down-to-earth style. Like FDR, he used fireside chats and phone-ins so people could talk directly to him. However, Carter failed to use the same tactic when reaching out to Congress, as he refused to use insider games like compromise and deal-making, even going so far as to alienating congressional Democrats. During his presidency, he focused much of his attention to battling the energy crisis that had occurred due to America's large reliance on imported oil. On April 18, 1977, during a fireside chat, Carter urged Americans to cut their consumption of oil and gas. On top of that, Carter had prepared and presented over 100 proposals concerning energy conservation and development. This was met with fierce resistance from oil-producing states and companies. Eventually, the National Energy Act was passed, which put a tax on gas-guzzling cars, removed price controls on oil and natural gas, and extended tax credits for developing alternative energy sources. He also created the Department of Energy to regulate existing supplies and fund research for the new sources of energy. Carter took special pride in his civil rights record, as his administration included more African Americans and women than any before. A notable example was Andrew Young, who Carter appointed as the first African American United States ambassador. Another example was the judicial branch, in which Carter appointed 28 African Americans, 29 women, and 14 Hispanics. Unfortunately, these actions were not enough to combat a sudden economic crisis. In the summer of 1979, the nation was hit with a second major fuel shortage due to renewed violence in the Middle East. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced another major price hike. Carter tried desperately to turn this around with an array of measures, none of which worked. He further worsened the situation by giving his now infamous Malaise speech, in which he stated how a crisis of spirit had struck, while at the same time blaming the Americans themselves for lack of confidence. In the eyes of most Americans, it seemed like the president had simply given up. By 1980, inflation had climbed to nearly 14%, and the standard living of the United States fell from first to fifth place, dragging Carter's popularity with it.
President Jimmy Carter was very focused on the United States foreign policy. He based much of it on human rights. Like former President Woodrow Wilson, President Carter sought to use moral principles as a guide for United States foreign policy. President Carter also believed that the United States needs to commit itself in promoting human rights, such as freedoms and liberties listed in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Carter's obsession with human rights led to a breakdown of relations with the Soviet Union. President Carter was simply angry over the Soviet Union's government policies and called for SALT II. In June 1979, Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev met and signed SALT II. SALT II overall provided limits of nuclear missile launchers each side could produce. The Camp David Accords was an agreement that provided for a 5-year transition period. During this period, Israel and Jordan would work out the issue of self-rule for the Palestinians. These peace talks occurred in Maryland presidential retreat called Camp David. The United States has been giving political and military assistance to the Shah of Iran since 1915. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a religious leader, led the rebels in overthrowing the Shah in January 1979. In November 1979, armed students seized the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. These harsh militants demanded the United States send back the Shah in return for the hostages. President Carter went through a 1-year standoff. In return, President Carter banned trade with Iran. After 444 days in captivity, hostages were released. One of Carter's main foreign challenges was the United States' role in Panama. In 1904, during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, the United States got permission to use and occupy the Panama Canal. Soon after that, there were negotiations regarding future status of the canal zone. A leadership amendment defied the United States' right to defend the canal. Eventually, this agreement passed the Senate, but it was lost. President Carter exemplified courage in concluding the negotiations, even though most Americans were opposed to it.
Although Jimmy Carter did do a lot in his presidency from 1977 through 1981, he has been very active post-presidency. President Carter has many long-lasting legacies surrounding us today. Because of President Carter's great care for the energy crisis, we see so much more about alternative energy than ever before. In many schools around the nation, students from the ages of 10 to 18 do projects teaching us the importance of alternative energy sources. Other than schools, we see many commercials on television than ever before. He can also be the reason that we see more blue recycling bins out at the end of our driveways. Other than the energy crisis, President Carter has been very influential in many other ways. President Carter viewed himself as a new type of Democrat. This is known as a conservative Democrat. Jimmy Carter was also known for creating SALT II, but that soon came to an end when we refused to enter Afghanistan in 1980. Jimmy Carter was also known for his idea of civil rights. President Carter made a very big deal on how foreign affairs will be judged on civil rights. President Carter ended up cutting aid to 2 of our very good friends, Argentina and Brazil, because they imprisoned and tortured many of their own people. After his presidency, he wanted to be remembered as a civil rights president. In his goal of creating peace, President Carter created a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. He also returned the Panama Canal to the people of Panama. In more modern terms, President Carter still thinks he knows better than many other presidents. When President Bush was trying to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, President Carter created a large group of people to go against President Bush. President Carter and his wife were also the founder of a club in many towns and schools today. This is a club that goes by the name of Habitat for Humanity. This is President Carter's legacy today.